Spolia refers to repurposed building stone for new construction, or decorative sculpture reused in new monuments. Whenever a natural or man-made disaster or conquest happened, the rubble or the ideologies that were taken down would lead to a rebuilding, a new orientation. In Ephesus, I saw my own rubble, a woman fragmented by trauma and health issues, trying to rebuild her life into something more livable. And amid the rubble were the narratives I studied as if they were islands of refuge. Encoded in them were the possibility for change. But they weren't islands. They spoke to each other. In them, I noticed they wrestled with some of the same demons I couldn't seem to tame. Erasure, internalized stigmatization, disarticulation, physical and emotional pain. The authors had a few strategies in common. Their texts were full of intertextual references, mixed tropes, and wordplay that managed to spin beauty out of despair while casting a new light both on the tyranny of significations, as Robbe-Grillet calls it, which is to say the paradigms of meaning enforced by those who oppress, marginalize, and even criminalize people whose differences are considered obstructions to their grip on power, and light on the nature of meaning and power itself. It seemed to me that early attempts by women to reclaim their stories, like Pizan and Cavendish, for example, required them to stretch conventional boundaries of genre, to try new modes of speaking, to get around paradigms that offered them little access to express their ideas and frustrations. Pizan repurposed fragments of history, appropriating even herself as a kind of artifact with self-naming. In this, she reconfigured and broadened the ways women were viewed. I initially struggled with this self-naming enterprise, wondering how she had the audacity to make herself her own protagonist. Since The Ark in the Sediment was published, I'd been holding a grudge against what had to be my own narcissism. How dare I think that what I had to say was worthy of another person's time and consideration? Cavendish is among a small handful of writers who planted the seeds of science fiction. How could a writer be so bold to appropriate emerging ideas in science and cast them into something as outrageous as talking bear men who were experimental philosophers and birdmen who were expert astronomers? I've always had one foot in scientific writing, both to find answers through neurology for my queer consciousness between my temporal lobe epilepsy and PTSD and so forth, and another foot in theoretical physics, which increasingly questions the way we've constructed reality itself. But how dare a non-scientist, a mere technical writer with fascinations, raise questions that were too big for her britches? This stirred my fascination with the Codex Cumanicus. This was the same fascination Cervantes took on with Don Quixote. How is it that some people were able to imagine written expression in a way that transformed the structure of narrative so completely that even their readers' self-narratives, or the way they constructed their own identities, priorities, and potentialities, changed? The Codex Cumanicus was not a forerunner in the genre, but its breadth of interest was. Typically, the form, which emerged in about the 2nd and 3rd centuries, addressed singular themes, reflections on Christianity or medicine or magical spells. The Codex Cumanicus juxtaposed translation, parables, riddles, all kinds of things between two covers, speaking to the more varied dynamics and needs of everyday lives and cultural transactions. I wanted to place such different variables in one book because books of a single theme and mode seemed unlike my life, which consisted of mundane means of survival and profound resonances with other people who often felt similarly broken in a world of physical, institutional, and ideological violence. While the book was in its early stages in 2019, I met for a manuscript consultation with Robert Lopez. Writing has always been a centrifugal and not a centripetal process for me. And when I begin in the peripheries of ideas that haven't yet been sublimated, my work is scattered and nearly incoherent. He encouraged me for my style and asked questions about what was holding me back. I'd expressed my fears of what I'd learned in my first book, that writing could mean. There would be pushback and interrogations, which is a nightmare for an agoraphobe like me. There would be fears of narcissism, fears of rejection. He said whenever I felt those anxieties creep up on me, I should lean into them, allow them to become matters for the work itself to tangle with, and let them work themselves out through writing as opposed to in writing. At the same time, I was reading Sami Schock, and I learned the power of speculative fiction to short-circuit internalized binary paradigms in which I'd always identified as inferior, physically and mentally broken, and complicit in my own victimization. In Kafir, I identified some of the cultural barriers that had fenced me in. And in Sami Schock, Alison Kafir, and Audre Lorde, I looked to intersectional feminism for answers. I wanted a book that first reflected on the particulars of my life, a memoir that drew on the strategies of fiction, remained true to the events that had shaped me. Then I wanted to take on the challenge of Michael Barabé to create deployments of disability in Part 2. Barabé notes that such deployments could only cast a fictional disability that was more or less referential to the lived experiences of the disabled, because writers are operating in a purely representational world. So I tried it. For example, I invoked figurative sculpture for their ever-eroding trajectories, whose fragmentation and loss were always overly interpreted through their audience's expectations for an unattainably ideal figure. Throughout the process, I'd update my daughter. My God, Kate, I have cephalopod gorgons. How am I going to deal with this? Though she's a teenager, she's brilliant when it comes to understanding human nature and institutionalized violence. We are, after all, an interracial family who went through boom and bust together. We would talk about the repercussions of revising ancient scrolls or surviving a repetitive life, even in the best of possible worlds, a utopia of sorts. Recently, she said to me, "It's like you've invented a therapy for yourself that works for you. It's like 2 years of therapy, and look how you've changed." I want more than anything to tap into the transformational power of juxtapositioning, of exploring alterity and neurodiversity and trauma as sources of strength and wonder. This book is a gathering of spolia, an attempt to build something new and to add to it whatever I've learned in the process. Therapists often urge their dissociative patients to integrate into a singular identity. Politicians and eugenicists want us to integrate into an average, an ideal, a mythologized purity and consistency. In Spolia, I'm saying Robert Lopez had it right. Lean into what you perceive to be sources of failure or weakness. Allow the dynamic self or selves to be at play with one another, and at the same time to sublimate unacknowledged personal and cultural raw material from the Cora, as Kristeva would have it. That's how you bust out of what was and into what could come into being.